This morning we're going to kind of finish up our last section before we actually get to the Reformation. This is the right to the edge of the Reformation, and this is out of chapter 34 from Gonzalez, and we're going to be covering the Renaissance and Humanism. Now, when I say humanism, of course, today we cringe, but the humanism we're going to be talking about then is just regular humanism before it became the not good humanism, if that makes any sense. But it plants the seeds for it. We have been walking through basically 1,000 years of bleh. That's a theologic term. It's not been fun. I mean, if you've noticed, sometimes you got to go through a lot of dark times to appreciate the good times, and we're just about to leap into some of the good times. But this morning we're going to look at the very last piece of the puzzle that God's going to use to leap into that. And we've talked about before that a lot of events that may not be so good on the surface, God turns, like he does so often in our lives. He turns and says, okay, that wasn't so cool, massacring people in crusades, but oh, wait a second, that just changed a whole economic and political system and knowledge and a whole bunch of other information that we now can do things with. And this basically comes into what we call the Renaissance. And Renaissance basically means rebirth. And the Renaissance, the term itself, a lot of times you look back on things and coin phrases, okay, that was the Golden Age or the Gilded Age or whatever. This particular phrase, the people in the time coined for themselves, which is kind of interesting. Of course, they also gave a nice label to the previous time period before their great rebirth and Renaissance, and they called it the Gothic period. We've been calling it the Middle Ages. They called it the Gothic period. So why would they, who are being reborn and rebirth of things, call the prior time Gothic? Why would they do that? To think back, why would they call it Gothic? Well, they didn't like it. They kind of looked down upon it. What does Gothic mean? Oh, good. Okay. Remember those little Ostrogoths and Visigoths? Remember them? What were they? Were they the nice people who came in and said, let me, cut with my knife and fork and we're going to work together on stuff? No. They were the enemies. They were the barbarians. Remember, anybody who didn't speak Greek or Latin was considered a barbarian. Remember the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths? Those were the kind of the guys who came sweeping through and kind of brought the final collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. And so, from their perspective, calling something Gothic, we talk about Gothic cathedrals. Well, they weren't calling them Gothic cathedrals. The Renaissance people coined the frame Gothic cathedrals because that's barbarian, that's not rebirth, that's not cool, this is substandard, it's not to the Greek and Roman standards and our new intellectual capabilities and all that stuff. So those folks called themselves Renaissance. The Renaissance was happening, and they called anything but before them, between the fall of the Roman Empire and them, Gothic, barbaric. Okay, the Goths were just a tribe. So you had the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. Those are two different branches, if you will, of those barbarians. So that's how they associated it. So when you talk about a Gothic cathedral, what we're really saying is, look, it's a barbaric cathedral. That's what they would have heard. We just go, oh, that's Gothic architecture, Gothic artwork. We've just picked up that phraseology. So it's kind of interesting. They thought of themselves as everything's being reborn, and everything before us was barbaric. So think about that mindset, just using those two terms. What does that tend to do to one's ego? Humility, right? It's going to make you much more humble and saying, we're just a humble people and grateful that God helped us learn and grow, right? You can already tell by the phraseology that they're applying to people prior to them and themselves. This is going to have some cool stuff, but it's also going to plant seeds for some other problems, and that's what we're going to see as we walk through here. Barbarians. Okay. The thing that we find next is we've already talked about the Greek and Roman literature, or Greek in particular, that had been protected and then was brought back during the Crusade time period. The Reconquista we talked about in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. Remember when you get to 1492, which is just before the leap of the Reformation, right in the middle of this Renaissance time period, they recaptured or recollected a lot of the materials that these former Romans, who were sort of taken over by the Muslims and kind of left alone, pretty much. A lot of the literature and a lot of the stuff, a lot of the learning was there that the Romans, the Jews, and others, even though the Ostrogoths and Visigoths have come through here, and Visigoths actually went through that area. The Vandals went through that area. Remember vandalism? Another one of those terms that we get. So we have Gothics, Goth, and Vandals, all from this barbaric time period. And this is where they start picking up a lot of the literature and a lot of the learning. We've talked about that. We talked about the Crusades that were precursors to this time period. That opens up the trade routes. It opens up communication. It also brings back a lot of the information from the Mideast, if you will, and the communication with Constantinople. Remember when the folks in Constantinople were under pressure by the Ottoman Turks, and they asked the Romans or the Roman bishops and everybody, please come help us. That was when they were trying to heal the schism, if you will. Remember the East-West schism from 1054. Now we're right near the mid-1400s. And they're saying, hey, let's unify under the Pope. They were trying to do that. It's not going to work, of course. But all these different factors are starting to change the way people are thinking. You now have learning, science, a little bit more freedom, that people can start thinking about things a little bit differently instead of running from where's the next Goth coming over the hill trying to kill me. You can start going, okay, was it the Pope trying to kill me or some other person trying to kill me? Because remember, we had the Inquisitions during these time periods too. All this stuff starts formulating and changes the way people think about themselves. We'll talk about that in a minute. How they think about government, because remember we used to have the church over the state, and now then the state with the church, and now some of the people are going, maybe a Republican form of government might be a better thing, and this is where we see the rise of the city-states, like Florence, Venice, and folks like that. And the reason that city-state could be there and have that kind of influence and that desire to be more independent is why. Why could that be? Because remember, we've been talking about feudalism during this time period. What's happened to allow that city-state idea to arise? Remember, that's also, the Greeks had a city-state methodology, a republican form of government in many places. Not all of them. Sparta was kind of dictatorial, but Athens at least. What would give these city-states the opportunity to have power and influence and all? Anybody remember? We've talked briefly about it. Yeah, trade. Yeah, the merchant class. So now money, merchant, trade, because of all these things are starting to open up. So people like the de Medicis, you've heard of Lorenzo de Medici. We've talked about him in the past. The Medici family, Borgia family actually comes from Spain, but they have influence. And a lot of these other very wealthy people have money, and they start having influence that's very, very significant in these particular areas. So all of these type of characteristics start coming together to change the way people start thinking. One of the key things, though, that you start seeing when you see Plato, Aristotle, a lot of the Roman thinkers, is a change in the thinking about who man is. Okay? During the Gothic period, the Middle Ages, prior to the Renaissance, in particular, I'll use this from an art perspective because we're going to talk about that in a minute, but from an art perspective, how many of you have ever seen that medieval Gothic art? What does it look like to us? John, you're an artist. Yeah, it's very flat. It's very two-dimensional. It almost looks like, your standard kid drew the thing, no real shading and whatever. What else is interesting about that art? What's different about it? Anybody remember some of the wonderful artwork? What shows importance in that type of artwork? Or if you remember that artwork. We're so not used to seeing it. Most of it's religious. Yeah, art is almost, okay, Christ is a sinner. But one of the things that you'll see about that artwork is the most important person or entity in the art is the biggest person. So, you see this big king sitting on the throne and these little people down in the corner, and here's some knights over here, and, they're different sizes and locations and proximity. When they're communicating importance and relevance and focus, it's based on size. When you see man in that artwork, that pre-artwork prior to the Renaissance, you see Adam in particular, because Adam was a topic of that artwork. He's frail, he's small, he's kind of cowery looking. Sistine Chapel. Anybody see an Adam that looks like that in the Sistine Chapel? No, he's Mr. Muscular, super buff dude reaching out to God, because that's a change in we're humble, frail, miserable creatures before God to look at us. Now, a lot of that look at us wasn't as horrible as I just made it sound. Because what key theological idea, once people start beginning to think about those things, might, in this rebirth of knowledge and science and all, appropriately placed, again I say appropriately, what could that be important?
Maybe like man is made in God's image.
Man is made in God's image. Okay, if man is made in God's image, and what have we done? We are reborn spiritually, but we're also reborn in our learning. We're reborn in the things. So a lot of the philosophers and the thinkers of this time, even though they're pulling a lot of pagan ideas, because this is how the Romans and Greeks thought, right? If you look at Roman and Greek statues, do you see cowering figures? No. So they're looking at that type of idea of man's ascendancy, if you will, and tying it with the theology that we're made in God's image, and therefore our minds, our bodies, all those things, the ideal man should be one that is using all those faculties, using all those capabilities, taking care of themselves, looking good, thinking good, walking good, doing good. So this ideal man idea starts coming into play. And if the entire knowledge base that you have access to could fit on half that bookshelf over there, literally, you realize like the Library of Congress, when Thomas Jefferson donated it, was less than that bookshelf. That was what the Library of Congress was started with. That was a Renaissance man, or an ideal man, or a universal man, because you literally, if you had the access to it, could know everything there was to know about engineering, architecture, science, etc. You were the Renaissance man. Fortunately, at that time, you could be a Renaissance man because there was so little information. Now you can't even be a Renaissance, do I know anything about what the latest new software the kids are, can't even keep up with it. I can't read the list of the new programs that are out there, much less knowledge in other fields, right? But at this time, that whole idea of we can achieve to be all God would have us to be was a really cool thing. So you see this whole thinking change. Now, in one sense, theologically, that's great, because we should therefore care for other people because they're made in God's image. Do you think that went over well? You think that was how they applied the we're made in God's image, therefore I should care about my other people in man? No. They grabbed hold of the other side of it, though, and said, look at us. But it was also a good thing for learning. I mean, isn't it good, if I can help make water better and health better and other things, or fire artillery better and break down my enemies and other people's walls and castles. See, knowledge works both ways, doesn't it? But that is one of the big things that we see in this universal man idea. That is going to affect the church. It's going to affect the state. It's going to affect how people think about things. Right now, though, it isn't changing theology. We're going to talk about that. What does that do, though? All these different factors. What is this going to do as a precursor for the Reformation? What is this going to permit, should I say? What can you think? Well, people are going to start thinking about things again. What have they been doing up to this time? mostly parroting, and the church father said this, and the council said that, or the pope said something else, right? You're not really questioning authority. By this time, authority and thinking is not real widespread. I mean, thinking isn't widespread. Authority is now being centralized. And we've also seen the papacy going, like this, and all the fights and all. So if you are allowed to start looking at new stuff, getting information that you didn't have, begin to question, we're going to see how that plays out. So just asking questions, we take asking questions for granted. But have you ever, gone through something and nobody ever asks any question about anything? What do you learn about that when nobody ever asks any questions?
They're afraid.
Well, one, they're afraid usually, or they're not thinking. They're just accepting it, whatever. And that's why we try to teach people here. It's the Bible. Anything I'm telling you here, this is church history. But you go back to the scriptures and think. I mean, but you can see what God's doing. Isn't it cool? How you can see God's just working all these different things together? So that helps us think about the life and the time we live in, right? Do we take these lessons and go, oh, it's all lost. The evil has taken over. I don't know, after 1,000 years, God's still working, isn't he? He's still moving all these things. He's still changing stuff. He's taking wars and fights and atrocities and still turning them to good for his people and for learning. So you start seeing all this type of stuff that starts coming into play. I've already mentioned in the realm of art, you get this shift from that Gothic art of the most important persons in the middle and the center or focus, etc. What kind of artwork, though, is now going to be associated with that realism, that ideal man? What's going to change in that? What's the kind of art that we're used to today? And I'm not talking about the modern abstract. Yes, I can throw a paint bucket against a white canvas art. I'm sure it's art, but...
Three-dimensional stuff.
Three-dimensional? What's that called? It's three-dimensional, but what's that called? John, you got a good word for it? No? 3D. More depth. Yeah, perspective. Linear perspective is what we do. You have the vanishing points and all that stuff. Now, what in that kind of artwork shows importance and relevance? Closeness to a central object, lighting, changing the light, putting the light focus and drawing things and putting people in different relative positions. But their size is all proportional to who they are. It's realistic. You also start getting the idea of God as creator. Well, how is it God creator? Well, you start seeing these pastoral scenes. You start seeing artwork that's not just about people and potentates. It's about, the natural world. Because people now start asking questions and start thinking and all those kinds of things, if that makes any sense. So you see all of this change. But who's going to pay for all that art? You see all the starving artist sales. Do you think they were like, Leonardo da Vinci going, hey, look, I slapped some, only 42 lira, do you think that's what he was doing? You had to have a patron. And where do those patrons come from? Well, they haven't become aristocrats quite yet, but not quite yet. The rich, which were centered where? Well, we're going to see the church also has a lot of money. So the church has to start competing. The merchants, yeah. How do you make yourself important if you're not nobility and you're not the church? Merchant, yeah. And therefore, they're the ones with all the money. And so those are the ones who are now saying, well, I can't paint, but I can hire Michelangelo. I can hire Leonardo da Vinci. I can hire Raphael. I can hire all sorts of other people. When you start thinking about this whole idea, these are the people that you start seeing the artwork in. Now, if the papacy by this time has gone down the tubes to looking much more like a secular prince type of idea versus a spiritual leader idea, what do you think the church is now going to do to compete with that? Hire their own painters. Yeah, hire their own architects. Hire their own people to go make everything pretty. And if the Pope's seat of power is in Rome, what do you think he's going to try to do with the city that he sits in? Make it look good, yeah. You're not going to say, hey, look, there's the slums coming in, and by the way, here's my bedroom that has all the cool paintings in it. It's going to decorate the city and make it a grand scale. And so what's that going to require? City planning. That's going to require waterworks stuff. You know, where are we getting that idea from? Oh, the Romans, who had aqueducts and fountains and all these other stuff, because now we're rediscovering their engineering techniques. Now we're rediscovering their stonework techniques. We're rediscovering concrete. You guys realize that? Concrete was a discovery of the Romans, lost, and then rediscovered. So people used to think it's magic, because see, concrete you can pour underneath water and it'll harden. How many other liquids do you, or soft stuff that you can pour into water that hardens? Not much, except on dishes. It doesn't matter what it is. You put it in there, it hardens. But they were the ones who discovered concrete. You rediscover concrete, man, can you do all sorts of stuff. So all these different types of things start developing, and so now the church, what's the city? Rome. Where now, guess what? If you're a cardinal or you're a bishop someplace else, what do you think you need to do? Make your city look pretty. If you're a competing merchant, what are you going to do? Make things look gorgeous. I mean, why do you think we have all these beautiful things? You go to Italy and see all this tourist stuff. Look at those fountains, look at those things. It wasn't because somebody said, I think we need a fountain over there, right? It was this whole idea of Renaissance in art and power and competition. Now, what is the church going to need to keep up with these merchants? Money. And where are they going to get that? From the people. And how are you going to coerce that money out of those peasants and rich people? Indulgences. Hey, what a great idea. Yeah. So, why do you think the indulgences became really, really, really corrupt during this time? They needed this money to compete with those wealthy merchants. See, it all starts fitting together. People don't, remember we've been talking about history is actions and reactions. If these guys start looking better than me, I have to start looking better than them, and they have lots of money, so I got to get lots of money, and they do it through trade, I do it through indulgences. There's the economy. I'm trading in souls and salvation, you're trading in wheat and grain and oil. It's just a trade.
Does that mean that artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci were getting wealthy too?
The artists typically were not getting wealthy. They weren't starving artists, but they were not poor artists. The starving artists were the ones who didn't get the patrons. Most of those guys, they spent most of the money on their studio, their apprentices. Because remember, when you're in those days, the artists could do certain things, but that's how you learned art. You learned how to grind powders. You didn't go down to the store and say, hey, I'm going to buy some Winsor watercolors. You went, okay, you go find to the market and get the rock, and you put it in the mortar and pestle and grind it up, and then you distill it, and then you put the oils into it, and then you put it on the paste, and by the way, if you screw up any of those processes, it's the wrong color, go do it again. And Da Vinci was famous for experimenting on different surfaces and substrates and things like that. And I mean, the Last Supper is a technological disaster. It might be a painting masterpiece, but what he did with that is absolute disaster. It started falling apart as soon as he finished painting it.
Oh, really?
They spend more time trying to keep that painting from disintegrating because of the substrates and the materials he used.
Why was it such a disaster? Did you not do it right? Or?
It's all experiment.
Oh.
You didn't go down there with the science that's been grinding paint for the last 200 years and all the other stuff to it. It was guesswork. Anybody knows anything about painting, putting it on expandable wood and putting liquid stuff on expandable wood? It doesn't stick real well. It warps. There's all sorts of other problems that goes along with that. But hey, if you're experimenting, it's cool. Now, the reason we associate Leonardo da Vinci with the Renaissance so much, besides it centralized and started in Italy and then expands to the rest of Europe, is Da Vinci was born, if my memory serves me, in 1452. What important event happened in 1453? Anybody remember? Fall of Constantinople. The Eastern Empire fell. So this is when all those books and learnings and refugees and all start pouring in to Europe because the Turks took over the city. And he dies in 1519. What kind of important event happened in 1517, of which we will be celebrating the 500th anniversary of next year, about this time? Yeah, the 95 Theses. Luther, sort of the nailing on the wall that kind of kicked off officially the Protestant Reformation. So Da Vinci lived right in the heyday of all this stuff coming in and died just after the kickoff of the Reformation, if you will. So that's why Da Vinci is so associated with it. And this was a very unique time period where you could learn this stuff. You could experiment with all these things. You could be a painter and an architect and an engineer and a sculptor and all those other things and still have, to do that. I mean, Da Vinci was a genius, but he also happened to be exactly at the right spot at the right time. So that's why we so much associate him with the Renaissance. But that's just the Italian Renaissance. There's Northern European Renaissance, the Dutch Renaissance, English, French, all sorts of other stuff that goes along with it, that whole rebirth idea. And these are the kinds of things that we see happening. Literature. You get people starting to write now. Instead of just copy, you start seeing writing. And you get ideas like the Oration of the Dignity of Man by a guy named Mirandola. And that was kind of the manifesto for the Renaissance. He studies everything. He sees that rational intellectual seed, especially with philosophy, that's going to lead men to be like angels and children of God. See, we're going to study and we're going to become who God would have us be, using our mind that He's given us, right? Nothing wrong with that. Creativity reflects the intellect. And again, what are we trying to do? Achieve the ideal man. Ooh, so close. What did he miss? We can't do it on our own. And what are we really trying to become imitators of? Are we trying to become the ideal man? Imitators of God, imitators of Christ, become Christ-like. But isn't He the universal ultimate man? Well, yeah, in one sense, yeah, but see how you can twist things really easy and almost hit it, but not quite. And so, yes, there is some truth in what the guys are saying, but if you miss the source, the power, the effort, and the object, just real close, 2 degrees off, what's going to happen in 150 years? Farther and farther and farther away, right? So see how I like Brennan sent a quote to the elder board that he got from Spurgeon. I thought it was really cool. He said, discernment is not the difference. This is Spurgeon's quote. I'm probably butchering it. Discernment is not the difference between right and wrong. Discernment is the difference between right and almost right. So most people argue, well, what's wrong with that? It's like, it's not that, it's you're close. Most people who are close think that's sufficient. There is a small gap between right and almost right. And almost right is going to lead you eventually to wrong. It's not going to start wrong. It's not even going to look mostly wrong. It's going to look almost right. Discernment is being able to see that's not exactly right. So that's where, but most people think right, wrong. This looked really good, doesn't it? Just what I read sounds really good, and it's really close, but it's not quite right. That's that discernment. But if you're in a rebirth time period, isn't everything open for grabs and yeehaw, let's go for it? You're almost giddy with excitement that look at what God's given us the ability to go do. Always be careful when you get giddy about something. Good chance of going slightly off beam. Then we have another guy named Niccolo Machiavelli. You know Machiavelli? The Prince, yes. And see, Machiavelli he's very much of a realist. I hate saying that, but he was. I mean, when he talks about how you actually rule governmental politics, he says, look really above reproach on the outside and then play cruel politics behind it. So keep the people happy, keep that beautiful image, and then be ruthless behind the scenes to maintain power. Because in those days, that's how they did it. Has anything changed today? No, except now people don't even care to look above reproach on the surface. You know, the nice, everything's perfect, and here's what's really going on. Machiavelli was kind of realistic. He says, man's not that good. So he got his anthropology good. It's not just not particularly wonderful thinking. So you have these guys that look at this ideal man, and then he says, well, look at who man really is. Now, if you could just meld those two ideas together appropriately and put it in a Christ-centered focus, you kind of got a nice balance. Yes, be all God can have you because he wants you to strive and grow and learn and grow and be like his son, and also recognize the wickedness and sinful of men and watch your heart and everything else. You know, it'd be nice, but that didn't happen. This is also the time period of the printing press. Good old Gutenberg. And early on, the printing press was used basically for academics. Almost everything that was printed went to universities and scholars. Early printing press typesets copied or emulated manuscripts. So how would you like to have a printing press that you're trying to piece together cursive, minuscule text together? So, you know, we talk about font types and how they convey information to make it easier or harder to read. Well, let's just say their early font type selections were really bad because it was handwriting. And, of course, if handwriting's not standardized, every book's going to be a little bit different. Also, they used lots of shorthand. They would use like 3 letters with a dot or something, and you'd have to know the Latin phrase that matched that. I mean, we talk about et cetera. You know, that's just a shortened Latin phrase. We just go, we don't even, you know, et al, A-E-T-A-L. You know, those are all shortened Latin phrases. We still use those types of things. Well, they use that kind of stuff extensively in these books and writing. So now you end up with a particular scholarly stuff, but guess what happens when people start getting multiple copies of things like old books and maybe the Bible? What's going to happen there? Yeah, people can start comparing them because everybody knows, you know, man isn't perfect in their copying. God's word is, but man isn't. So now, beforehand, you had one copy of one text. You had nothing to compare it from. It was from the same monastery or from the same source you got it from. Now they can start comparing because I can print my version and your version, and we start reading them and going, wait a second, where'd that passage come from? Or where'd that passage go to? Or why are these words different? And so people can actually now start critically thinking, and this is where textual criticism begins. People also, because they've learned language and rhetoric and all sorts of other stuff, they can start saying, now wait a second, the language in this letter does not match the language of all these other ones. Maybe we have a problem, right? Styles and times and people tend to have very similar characteristics, especially in an academic environment. When you end up with a gentleman named Lorenzo Valla, and there was a very important document that the Pope held onto. It's called the Donation of Constantine, and that was the standard of papal authority. That was supposedly Constantine said, "Hey, the Pope, you've got all this stuff, and you have all this power, and you have all these things." That was the Donation of Constantine. Well, Valla, who happened to be, by the way, the secretary to the Pope, so this probably is not going to go over real well with the Pope, studied all this stuff and said, language all wrong for that time period of Constantine, because I now have letters that I can compare and writings from the time of Constantine, which we know are true, and this document, which clearly is not from the time of Constantine based on the language and the structure and everything. Mr. Pope, you don't have that authority that you've been claiming for 1,000 years. How many people think they want that one made public? The Pope sure doesn't, but, you know, at this particular time it's locked into the academic world, so it doesn't get out quite yet. Later on it does, and then people go, sorry, you've been claiming this authority based on a false document. Ooh.
So is that claim still made? That the authority comes from there?
Well, see, this was about lands and power and things like that. I don't know if the Catholic Church still makes that claim. I think they all kind of go, yeah, it's not going to work. So, the idea of the Apostles' Creed. Oh, that's the Apostles' Creed. It came from the Apostles. You know, because over time, what has happened? People at the time knew it wasn't by the Apostles, but people who have lost track on stuff might go, well, it's called the Apostles' Creed. It must come from the Apostles. They go, nah, it didn't. How shocking would that be if you grew up your whole life saying that's the Apostle Creed, the Apostles made this creed, and I've been taught that since, kindergarten, Sunday school, and some scholar tells you the Apostles never wrote this. Lots of disturbing things, good things, but also disturbing things come out of this. So you see there's some very profound impacts. The idea of science, philosophy, began looking for empirical data instead of superstition. This whole idea is, well, okay, give me some evidence. Let's look at it. Before, a lot of people were very searching for God in nature and things like that, but there was no scientific method that went along with it. Because it was like, well, the rose is red and that's the blood of Christ, and the thorns were on the rose were, the torments and sin. And see, that's how I describe a rose scientifically. From a theological, metaphoric, remember allegory was the big thinking pattern? Well, out of all this stuff, they start bringing back going, people actually used to ask questions. And they start asking questions, and they start saying, well, what's evidence? I mean, think about Roman law. Roman law, talk about all the things you had to prove and evidence and standards and all that kind of stuff. People started going, maybe we need to think about things a little bit differently. Nothing wrong with that. What happens, though? Because now we can explain everything, God doesn't exist. That's ultimately where it goes. And for all of you who have been in some of my other classes, that's called pie theology. The Bible is written in cake theology. If you need explanation, I will explain that to you later. But that's what happens. People like Galileo and Copernicus come on the scene going, hey, we're observing this. I can tell you, if you read Calvin's commentaries in Genesis, he talks about, you might convince me that the sun and the moon are opaque, but you will never convince me that they're solid. Because the Bible says they are lights, and lights aren't solid, they're just lights. Meantime, Copernicus and Galileo are going, no, I think they're solid. And so theologically, you get one group going, hey, that can't be, and the other group, because look, it's lights, and the other group is going, observable, they're solid, they're real, they're not just lights. Matter of fact, we know that the moon is reflecting light.
My question is, why were they getting that if they knew better than that?
They didn't know better than that. That's the whole point. Nobody knew. If you look at cosmology up until this time period, when we talk about the music of the spheres, people saw the planets going in crystalline spheres and rotating around, and that's how Aristotelian cosmology was. That was based on their observation. Copernicus, Galileo, people like that went, the observational data tells us that's not how it really works. But that's a big change, right? Just even thinking in those terms. If you're not used to thinking in those terms, a guy like Calvin would say, no, that's not what the Bible says. Right? Because it says lights, right? Literally says lights. We're going back to the scriptures. It says lights. Not planets, not objects, not moons, not whatever. Big deal. But is there any contradiction between that God made a greater and a lesser light to rule the day and the night, and one being a sun that's made of nuclear whatever, and the other one's a rock that's reflecting the light from the sun? Is there any conflict with that? No. But at that time, that's a big deal. It's not the Bible's wrong. It's not that the scientists are right. It's just understanding them appropriately. This time, these are the things that are beginning to float into thinking patterns. This is a radical change. But what does it do also from a theologic perspective now? What is it going to permit? Thinking, yeah. Instead of just looking at and saying the council said this and the church fathers said that, they're going to go back and look at it and say, do we agree with what they said? Here's their arguments. Do we agree with this? Does this fit with the scriptures? Did they come to the proper conclusion? Wait a second. This council said this, then this council changed their mind, and then this council changed something else, and then that pope rescinded this. Okay, we got a problem here. Where's our authority? In all these guys? In all these events? Or is it in, the text in the Bible? So it starts opening up the ability for guys like Luther and Calvin and people like that to say, it's the scriptures. Up until this time, you didn't have much choice. You remember John Huss and Wesley and people like that, burned at the stake, dug up posthumously, thrown in, They were considered heretics for actually saying the Bible could be like the actual authority, and it's not your councils or your popes or your bishops or your priests or whatever. But all of this rebirth of thinking, knowledge, learning that is working in both the secular realm and the theological realm. Now later on we're going to see in the Reformation that the printing press is going to become a huge deal. Huge deal, because this is where you can get texts and Bibles and copies and pamphlets and arguments into the hands of the common people. And what is one of the key things to getting those texts into the hands of the common people? They can read it for themselves, and how are they going to do that, though, since nobody speaks Latin and Greek except scholars? What's going to be critical? Translations into what? Whatever language, yeah. So see, this is where you start seeing the big shift and the big ideas, even though, Wycliffe and some others, were forerunners of it, translations of the scriptures into the language of the people. And this is where German gets standardized by Luther's translation, and French gets standardized by Calvin's translation, and the KJV helps standardize English, moving from Middle English to modern English. So it's interesting, the scriptures themselves are what starts standardizing reading, writing, language, vocabulary, style, structure, grammar, punctuation in all these languages, all because now people have to go back and look at the scriptures in a language they understand. Still doesn't mean that the scholars aren't back behind the scenes. We'll see Erasmus and people like that going back to the original text. But for the common people to get it, I can either translate it into something you understand, or I can have to teach you two really old languages that we barely, that they barely get. Okay. Now, we also get these ideas of what we called Scholasticism. Now, the real Scholasticism are centered around guys like Thomas Aquinas. Okay? Aquinas was a tremendous theologian. You don't agree with everything he said, but man, that dude was smart. That guy did his very best, and we still see the impact of a lot of his stuff today. Again, he only had so much to go on, but with what he did have to go on, he did a really good job in many areas. Not all, but many areas he's pretty good. So again, just because he was a Catholic scholar does not mean that he was fully errant in everything. Matter of fact, he kind of got into trouble for challenging some of the stuff the church was believing. Okay? People weren't real as crazy about Aquinas unless they could use his work, just like they can use Augustine's to support whatever position they wanted. Just like today, isn't that what we do? Well, John so-and-so said this, or Pastor so-and-so said this, or I read in that commentary that, and that justifies it's right. Or maybe that's a good idea, and let's go look at it. Hey, isn't that Berean? Receive these things joyfully and then go see if they're true. So receive those things joyfully and then go see if they're true. So again, we get those textual criticism. We see the language stuff. We see the development of translations beginning, or will shortly. We see the printing press making things available to people to learn and grow from. We see disagreements within the scholarship and people being able to evaluate things at a scholarly level. It hasn't got down to the people yet. That's where we're going to go next. But it's getting there. You got a guy named William of Ockham. Anybody heard of Occam's razor? That's what most of us are familiar with. Occam's razor, whenever presented with, paraphrasing, whenever you're presented with several possibilities, the simplest one is most often going to be the correct one. If you have these solutions. In other words, the the Rube Goldberg machine solution of how things happened is probably less likely than, yeah, they dropped their pen on the floor, versus there was an alien creature that came here and transmuted this thing and found the blood of some... No. Simpler explanation is more likely to be true. That's called Occam's razor. But he also then said, but reason is not going to be able to give you the answers. Faith will. Because he's now defending things from a biblical faith perspective, because he goes in reason and say God is omnipotent. He's also omniscient. So there's nothing impossible for God. He's not bound by human reason or understanding of good or evil, because good and evil were a big deal. Still are in most cases. So to say that God is bound by good or evil would be to say there's a standard which God himself must approach, as opposed to God is the definition, which is what he says. God is the definition of what good is. So whatever he does is good. Because isn't that one of the arguments that you hear today? Well, God would never let that bad thing happen, so God must be bad because he's not doing the right thing. Isn't that one of the arguments? Well, Occam is dealing with that very argument. He's saying, no, you can't hold through human reason God to the standard of some what's right and wrong and good and evil, because he is the definition of good. He, by definition, defines what that is. But he also, there's a small miss on this one, small miss, is because that then that leads you to the logical conclusion that God could have done anything. In particular, Jesus didn't have to come. There was no requirement except God just so decreed it. Okay, where's that 2% variance of discernment between right and almost right? What's the critical thing that has to be understood?
That he couldn't look on sin.
Because?
Because of his righteousness, God just can't decree to ignore.
Okay, good. It deals with who God is that will bind or dictate. Remember, God is still bound by who he is. He's not free to sin, is he? He's not free to be evil. He's not free to ignore sin because he's just. So within the framework of who God is, so the logical extension of he could have done it any other way, well, he might have done it in some other form or structure, but because of who God is, sin had to be dealt with. All right? So that's the thing that you have to keep in mind. God is bound by his own nature of who he is. You know, that's that silly argument, can God make a rock bigger than he can pick up? It's like, okay, you think you missed the point of who God is. See, God is not bound by those types of things because that doesn't fit. So this guy's really, really close, but if you forget God is who God is going to be the definer. And that's why we teach attributes of God. If you know who God is, you then can, when these questions come into play, you can say, that does not fit the character of God. That is not even a logical question to ask. See? So Occam has some really good argument here about reason. Man can't hold God hostage by man's reason to man's standard of what is right and wrong. Just don't go too much further beyond that, right? Because then you can start applying those logics to make them illogic. See all the great thinking that's going on in here, theology. Using Occam's razor, you can solve about 3/4 of the problems that you have in life. Applying who God is, you can solve the other 3/4 of them. Because there's... No, I'm sorry. Am I doing math wrong? So again, these people are looking at... They're seeing the rise of man's reason is supreme. They're trying to say, no, God's glory is supreme. So these guys are defending against that rise of reason beyond reasonableness, outside the bounds of who God is. So these are the kinds of things that you start seeing. Isn't this all great setup for the Reformation? And that's what we're going to see. The other thing that you have to realize, and this is something we all run into this problem, we all struggle with it, we all have issues in different times more than less. The Reformation is going to run into the same problem, is the more academic you get, the more questions about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin that you're going to debate, the more PhD theses of the more subterms of the technical junk that you're going to have to come up with to define terms, to debate, to argue, to, And guess what that does to theology? Well, it basically destroys any practical value to it whatsoever, because now it's gone. It's now into great debates over word choices. It becomes dead. And we see some reaction to that in some works by people read even today, The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. Some really good stuff in there. I'm not going to tell you it's the best in all senses, but the guy does understand it. And here's something in your notes. It says, if you will receive profit, read with humility, simplicity, and faith, and seek not at any time the fame of being learned. Okay? What are you trying to do when you're studying? It's not saying studying's bad, okay? Which unfortunately some people will say, oh good, I just have to be humble, so that means I need to be ignorant. Ignorant and humility are not the same thing. Most people who are ignorant in those areas become prideful in their ignorance. Forgive me for saying that, but they do. The other side you fall off on is I'm becoming learned because I'm so smart, and they lose their humility and the pride of their learnedness. He's trying to say, if you're going to learn, and you should, be humble. Read with faith. And it's not about becoming smart, it's becoming godly. It's about living life in a godly way. It says, on the day of judgment, you will not be asked what you have read, but what you have done. Well, I've read the following 16 commentaries in the original languages. And not important unless it profited you. It says, what is good for you will be able to discuss the Trinity. What good is it for you if you'll be able to discuss the Trinity with great profundity, and if you lack humility, thereby offend the Trinity? Right? That doesn't say don't be able to defend the Trinity with great profundity. It says, but if you don't do it with humility, you offend God that you're trying to, explain. Verily, high-sounding words do not make one holy and just, but a life of virtue does make one acceptable to God. It is better to feel repentance than to be able to define it. If you were to memorize the entire Bible and all the sayings of the philosophers, what good would this be to you without the love of God and without grace? Vanity of vanities. All is vanity except loving God and serving only God. Cool stuff. See, the guy understands the danger of academic arrogance. But he's also not telling you, therefore don't study. That's that healthy balance, that hard thing that we run across a lot of times. Now, there is a lot of stuff in the last part of your notes about various popes. I'm just going to touch on 2 or 3 of them because we're pretty much out of time. But this is just going to give you the history of everything runs right up to the Reformation. We have this guy, Nicholas V. He basically was the guy who starts this whole making Rome fancy. Let's get the art, let's get the other kinds of stuff that's going on, in particular the Vatican and St. Peter's Basilica. The other thing that he is kind of noted for, which we're not real proud of, but he ends up in 1452 issues a papal bull, or his direction, granting the King of Portugal the right to reduce pagans and unbelievers to hereditary slaves. This became the beginning of the European colonial expansion and thus legitimizing African slave trade in terms of religious authority and mission. This is the guy who says it's biblical to enslave people who aren't Christians. Right. So this is the guy who gives that authority, and the slave trade goes on for 350 years from then on. Even if once you have kids, it's your kids and kids and kids and kids. So it's not like you're enslaved and your kids are free. You're enslaved. There's a later pope here who says, and it's Pius II, he says, if you're recently baptized Christians, you could become unenslaved. And of course, you know how many people paid attention to that. Almost nobody. So unfortunately, he sets that up. Calixtus III comes from the Spanish Borgia family. Hey, anybody know about the Borgias? What's the famous Borgia lady? Lucretia. And Lucretia Borgia was a famous poisoner. She was a nasty lady. And he comes from the Borgias. So they basically get a lot of people into power, Pope Alexander VI, as it says, becomes the poster child for papal corruption. I'll point that out in a second. Of course, he reinforced that slavery was legitimate according to the scriptures and the church. Yikes. Paul II, he basically wants to install his own people, but the cardinals limited him. But he collects art and jewelry. He embraces the printing press and actually does some things that tries to get books and stuff into the hands of scholars and even a few into the regular people. But his excesses and luxuries are proverbial, and his concubines were publicly acknowledged in papal courts. So much for celibacy and fidelity and marriage. I'm celibate, and here's all my concubines. The pretty ladies in a row. No, that's England. That's not this. Sixtus IV, corruption and nepotism reaches new heights, if it couldn't already. He basically uses the papacy for wealth and power. He builds a huge amount of money beautifying Rome. He commissions Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel because he's Sixtus. That's why it becomes the Sistine Chapel. He also comes from Padua, and it was also where Galileo and other people like that. So he sort of encouraged a lot of free thinking and stuff in that city. He also allowed condemned criminals to be dissected, which, as bad as that sounds, it also made a tremendous amount of progress in medicine and anatomy, physiology, a lot of Da Vinci's work, because they've been using Galen's work from Rome, which was 1,500 years old, for their medical practices up to this date. That was the best there was. He is a Roman physician. Alexander VI, he purchased everything and anything. They said he participated in all the 7 deadly sins except gluttony because he had digestive problems. And it says of Alexander, he is ready to sell the keys, the altar, and even Christ himself. He is within his rights since he bought them all. So, corruption. He maintained concubines, fathered many children. Of course, Lucretia Borgia. Go read about her. Nasty lady. Political intrigues, murder. He even, he legitimized his offspring and gave them great estates and power and all sorts of stuff. So there wasn't even the guys. Machiavelli said, put this wonderful image up and then play, tyrant behind it. He didn't even care. This guy was really, really bad. You get to Julius II, which is right up to before the Reformation. He took his name from Julius Caesar. He went around in papal armor and had wars and did all sorts of stuff. He was referred to as Julius the Terrible. But under his reign, Michelangelo finished the Sistine Chapel, and Raphael decorated the Vatican with the famous frescoes. The last guy is Leo X, because this is going to cross us into it. He's from the Medici family. Florence, those were the guys that made sure that Savonarola got killed. The guy who was trying to reform and try to bring some sanity to Florence. That family. He didn't have quite as much power as Julius did, but he was able to reestablish the Roman university in Rome. Significant professors he got there to get some center of learning. He spent tons and tons of money, and the way he got a lot of the money, he sold memberships in the Knights of Peter. Borrowed sums, borrowed from bankers, borrowed stuff, took things from people, etc. He even sold cardinals' hats. So if you ever wonder for a Halloween costume, you're trying to find a cardinal hat, you would have had to go to Leo X. He would have found you one. He also becomes the guy who is famous for the sale of indulgences to finish Peter's Basilica. And if you notice his time, 1513 to 1521. What happens to small, smack dab in the middle of that one? 95 Theses, and Lucer's sing about the corruption of indulgences, which, by the way, the 95 Theses are mostly about corruption, practices of indulgence, not about theology. Later on, it becomes about theology, but at that point, he's just like, this is just so wrong. Even a good Catholic monk can't handle this anymore. And so this is the guy, this is where Tetzel and all the other people came through with this dude. So when we get there, this is where we end up. And all of this sets everything up for the time for the Reformation.